In the year 1912, the world stood on the precipice of a new age. The titanic struggle of industry and innovation had begun to reshape the very fabric of human existence. Across the sprawling landscape of Massachusetts, a state long steeped in the annals of American history, the hum of burgeoning factories mingled with the quiet whispers of ancient forests and the relentless rhythm of the Atlantic tide. It was a time of gaslights giving way to electric bulbs, of horse-drawn carriages sharing cobblestone streets with the nascent automobile, and of telegrams carrying news with unprecedented speed. Yet, beneath this veneer of progress, older, more fundamental truths persisted. The vast, untamed wilderness, the deep-seated superstitions of isolated communities, and the ever-present shadow of the unknown still held sway, particularly in the quieter, more remote corners of the Commonwealth. Massachusetts, with its rich tapestry of colonial past and burgeoning modernity, was a place of stark contrasts. The intellectual hubs of Boston and Cambridge bustled with academic vigor and social reform, while further west, the Berkshire Mountains loomed, silent and inscrutable, their peaks often shrouded in mist. Along the rugged coastline, fishing villages clung precariously to the land, their inhabitants hardened by the sea, their lives inextricably linked to its unpredictable whims. It was in these liminal spaces, where the light of progress flickered and the darkness of ancient lore still held sway, that the most unsettling events often found their genesis. The year itself was marked by a peculiar duality. Optimism soared with the promise of new discoveries and technological marvels. Yet, 1912 would also be indelibly etched into the collective consciousness by the sinking of the Titanic, a catastrophic event that served as a chilling reminder of human fallibility and the indifferent power of nature. This grand, distant tragedy, however, would be eclipsed, for some, by a far more localized, more insidious mystery that would unfold not on the vast, impersonal ocean, but within the familiar, domestic confines of Massachusetts itself. It was a mystery that did not involve a sudden, spectacular disaster, but rather a slow, creeping erosion of reality, a subtle unraveling that left behind a void filled only with questions and a pervasive sense of dread. The spring of 1912 arrived with its usual deceptive promise. The harsh grip of winter loosened, giving way to the gentle thaw and the first tentative greens of new growth. Communities that had endured the long, isolating months of cold began to stir with renewed activity. Farmers prepared their fields, fishermen mended their nets, and the rhythms of daily life resumed their familiar cadence. Yet beneath this ordinary surface, a disquiet began to stir, imperceptible at first, like a faint tremor deep beneath the earth. It was an uneasiness that would gradually coalesce around a series of inexplicable occurrences, transforming the mundane into the menacing, and the familiar into the profoundly alien. The stage was set, not for a grand historical drama, but for a chilling vignette of human vulnerability in the face of an encroaching, nameless dread. The air itself seemed to grow heavy, imbued with an unspoken premonition, a subtle shift in the very fabric of existence that hinted at something deeply amiss. The state's landscape itself seemed to hold its breath, from the gnarled apple orchards of the Pioneer Valley to the dense, whispering pine forests of the north. There were places still untouched by the hurried pace of modern life, places where old stories lingered like the scent of wood smoke, and where the boundary between the natural and the supernatural felt thin and permeable. It was in one such unassuming locale, nestled away from the bustling thoroughfares and the bright lights of the cities, that the events of that year would begin to unfold, leaving an indelible mark not only on the immediate community, but on the very concept of what could be considered real. The year 1912 would, for those who remembered, forever be associated not just with progress and grand events, but with a lingering shadow, a testament to the persistent, unsettling power of the unknown that lies just beyond the edges of human comprehension. Our story draws us to Havenwood, a small insular community nestled within the coastal expanse of Massachusetts. It was not a place of grand aspirations or significant industry, but rather a town defined by its quiet resilience and its deep connection to the sea. Its name, in retrospect, possessed a cruel irony, for in the spring of 1912, Havenwood would become anything but a haven. The inhabitants of Havenwood were, for the most part, descendants of the earliest European settlers, their lives interwoven through generations of intermarriage and shared experience. They were a stoic people, their faces weathered by the salt spray and the harsh coastal winds, their hands calloused from generations of labor. Fishing was the lifeblood of Havenwood, the rhythm of the tides dictating the ebb and flow of their existence. Men would leave before dawn, their small vessels cutting through the pre-dawn gloom, returning hours later with their catch, their wives and children waiting on the docks. The small cannery near the harbor provided what few other jobs existed, its pungent aroma a constant fixture in the salty air. Life in Havenwood was simple, predictable, and hard-won. Luxuries were few, and entertainment often consisted of storytelling by the hearth, the shared warmth of community gatherings, or the solemn quiet of Sunday services. The outside world, with its frantic pace and newfangled contraptions, felt distant, almost irrelevant. News arrived slowly, carried by occasional travelers, or the weekly newspaper delivered by train to the nearest larger town, a journey of several hours. This isolation fostered a strong sense of community, a tightly knit social fabric, where everyone knew everyone else, and where shared hardships forged unbreakable bonds. But this very closeness also meant that any disruption, any deviation from the norm, resonated with an amplified intensity, ending ripples of unease throughout the entire town. Among the families of Havenwood, one name would become tragically central to the events that were to unfold: the Blackwoods. Elias Blackwood was a man of quiet demeanor, known for his meticulous fishing practices and his unwavering devotion to his family. His wife, Martha, was the picture of a coastal matriarch, resilient, resourceful, and deeply spiritual. They had 2 children, a daughter, Elara, barely 16, whose artistic spirit often felt somewhat out of place in the pragmatic world of Havenwood, and a younger son, Thomas, a spirited boy of 10, whose boundless energy was a constant source of both joy and exasperation. The Blackwood family represented the very essence of Havenwood, hard-working, interconnected, and seemingly unremarkable. Their home, a modest 2-story house, stood a short distance from the main cluster of buildings, nestled on a small rise overlooking a less frequented cove. It was a well-maintained dwelling, its weathered clapboards painted a faded blue, a testament to Martha's relentless efforts to maintain a sense of order and beauty amidst the constant challenges of coastal living. A small garden, meticulously tended by Elara, offered a splash of vibrant color against the muted tones of the landscape, a small beacon of life amidst the encroaching wildness. The spring of 1912 initially brought the usual cycle of renewal to the Blackwood household. Elias prepared his fishing gear, Martha busied herself with spring cleaning, Elara sketched the nascent blossoms, and young Thomas explored the nearby tide pools with an insatiable curiosity. There were no omens, no portents, no grand pronouncements of impending doom. Only the gentle turning of the seasons, the comforting routine of daily life, and the predictable rhythms of a town that had, for generations, endured the caprices of nature and the passage of time. Yet, it was this very normalcy, this comforting predictability, that would soon be shattered. The seemingly unyielding stability of Havenwood, the quiet strength of its people, and the serene domesticity of the Blackwood family were all about to be tested by an event so profound in its strangeness, so absolute in its mystery, that it would forever alter their perception of reality. The tide was about to turn, not with a sudden, violent storm, but with a slow, creeping darkness that would engulf the town, leaving behind only the cold, hard questions of what had truly transpired in the quiet isolated community of Havenwood. The first signs of something amiss in Havenwood were subtle, easily dismissed as the ordinary vagaries of life. It began not with a scream or a dramatic discovery, but with an absence. On the morning of April 17, 1912, Elara Blackwood awoke, as was his custom, before the first blush of dawn. The air was crisp, carrying the familiar scent of salt and damp earth. He dressed in the dim light, preparing for another day out on the fishing grounds. Martha was still asleep beside him, her breathing soft and even. Elara's room was quiet, and he assumed Thomas was still deep in childhood dreams. Elias made his way to the small kitchen, kindling the fire in the stove for coffee. He expected to find Elara already awake, perhaps sketching by the window as she often did at that hour, or assisting her mother with some early chores. But the kitchen was empty. A faint impression of Elara's usually neat bed suggested she had indeed slept there, but her small collection of sketchbooks and charcoals lay undisturbed on her desk. A slight, almost imperceptible chill seemed to permeate the air in her room, despite the rising morning temperature. Initially, Elias thought little of it. Perhaps Elara had gone for an early walk along the shore, a favorite pastime of hers, to capture the dawn light. He finished his coffee, gathered his gear, and with a brief kiss to Martha's forehead, he departed, the creak of the door a familiar sound in the quiet house. He fully expected to see Elara later, perhaps at the docks when the boats came in, or certainly by supper time. As the morning wore on, Martha Blackwood awoke. She noticed Elara's absence as well, but like Elias, attributed it to an early stroll. Yet, as the hours stretched into midday, a faint knot of unease began to form in her stomach. Elara was always prompt, always considerate. She would have left a note, or at least mentioned her plagues. Martha checked the small shed where Elara kept her gardening tools. They were all in place. She walked down to the small rocky cove Elara frequented, calling her name into the salt-laced wind. Only the mournful cry of gulls answered. The afternoon passed, each minute adding to Martha's growing anxiety. By the time Elias's boat returned in the late afternoon, the small knot of unease had blossomed into a full-blown dread. The sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in hues of orange and purple, a beauty that felt starkly out of place with the growing terror in Martha's heart. Thomas, oblivious to the gathering storm of his parents' fear, played by the edge of the water, building castles from wet sand. When Elias stepped off his boat, his face tired but otherwise normal, Martha met him with a strained voice. "Elias, Elara isn't back. She's been gone all day." The words hung in the air, heavy and unyielding. Elias's brow furrowed. He felt a cold prickle of apprehension. This was not like Elara. He checked her room again, more thoroughly this time. Nothing seemed out of place, yet everything felt wrong. Her Sunday dress still hung in the wardrobe. Her only pair of good shoes remained in the corner. It was as if she had simply stepped out, without a single trace, without a single indication of where she might have gone. As darkness descended, enveloping Havenwood in its inky embrace, the true gravity of Elara Blackwood's disappearance began to sink in. The gentle sound of the waves, usually a soothing lullaby, now seemed to mock their growing panic. The wind, which had once felt refreshing, now whispered tales of cold and emptiness. Elias and Martha, along with a few concerned neighbors who had heard the increasingly frantic calls, began a cursory search around the house and along the immediate coastline, their lanterns cutting weak, trembling arcs through the oppressive gloom. There were no footprints in the soft sand beyond the usual tide marks. No torn piece of fabric caught on a thorny bush. No discarded item, no sign of struggle, no indication of foul play. It was as if Elara Blackwood, a vibrant, artistic young woman, had simply dissolved into the air, leaving behind nothing but an aching void and the unsettling silence of her absence. The quiet, predictable life of Havenwood had been irrevocably breached, not by a sudden, violent storm, but by a chilling, inexplicable evaporation of one of its own. The unraveling had begun. The initial response to Elara Blackwood's disappearance was a mixture of disbelief and frantic activity. In a community as close-knit as Havenwood, an absence was immediately felt, a gap in the familiar tapestry of daily life. By the morning of April 18th, the news had spread like wildfire through the small town. Neighbors, abandoning their daily tasks, gathered at the Blackwood home, their faces a mixture of concern and a nascent fear. Elias Blackwood, his usual stoicism now replaced by a haunted desperation, organized the first official search party. Men who knew every rock and tide pool along the coast, every path through the dense woods behind the town, fanned out. They combed the shoreline, shouting Elara's name into the biting wind. They meticulously searched the small patches of forest, their eyes scanning for any disturbance in the undergrowth, any misplaced item, anything that might offer a clue. Women prepared food for the searchers, their conversations hushed, punctuated by worried glances towards Martha, who sat by the window, her gaze fixed on the empty path leading to the sea. The hours stretched into days. The initial hope, fueled by the sheer number of searchers and their intimate knowledge of the terrain, began to wane. Each returned group reported the same disheartening news. Nothing. No trace. No trace. It was as if the very earth had swallowed Elara whole. The only objects found were a few unremarkable fishing floats and a single smooth piece of sea glass, utterly unrelated to her. By the third day, the local constable, a portly but well-meaning man named Chief Miller from the nearest larger town, was summoned. He arrived by horse and buggy, bringing with him a sense of official gravity, but little in the way of new methods. His experience was limited to petty theft and drunken brawls, not disappearances of this baffling nature. He interviewed Elias and Martha, Thomas, and several neighbors. He scribbled notes in a small ledger, his pen scratching against the paper, each sound amplifying the silence of their unanswered questions. "No enemies?" he asked, his voice gruff but not unkind. "No disagreements? No suitors?" Elias and Martha shook their heads, their voices hollow. Elara was a good girl, quiet and artistic, not given to conflict or secret rendezvous. "She wasn't dressed for a journey," Martha added, her voice barely a whisper, recalling the clothes Elara had left behind. Constable Miller, after a thorough but ultimately fruitless examination of the Blackwood home, concluded that there was no sign of forced entry, no struggle. It appeared that Elara had simply walked out, under her own volition, or under some unseen compulsion. But where? And why? As the days turned into a week, the search began to dwindle. The initial burst of communal effort gave way to a weary resignation. Hope, that most resilient of human emotions, began to curdle into a bitter despair. The people of Havenwood, once so united in their purpose, now cast nervous, suspicious glances at each other. Had someone seen something? Was someone holding back information? The close-knit fabric of the community began to fray, undermined by the pervasive sense of an unseen threat. Whispu. Whispers began to circulate, hushed and fearful. Some spoke of the dangers of the sea, of rogue waves or treacherous currents, though no storm had been reported. Others murmured about the dense woods behind the town, recounting old tales of strange creatures and forgotten paths. More chilling still were the suggestions of something darker, something unnatural. Old women, their eyes clouded with memory, spoke of the land itself holding secrets, of ancient restless spirits disturbed by the living. For the Blackwoods, each passing day was an agony. Martha became a ghost in her own home, her laughter replaced by a perpetual silent vigil. Elias, once so strong and capable, seemed to shrink, his shoulders bowed under the crushing weight of the unknown. Young Thomas, no longer playing with the carefree abandon of childhood, watched his parents with wide, frightened eyes, sensing the profound chasm that had opened in their lives. The absence of Elara was not just a missing person. It was a gaping wound in the heart of their family, a wound that refused to heal, festering with unanswered questions and an ever-deepening sense of dread. The formal investigation, such as it was, slowly ground to a halt. Constable Miller, with no new leads and no physical evidence, could do little more than file a report. The official conclusion, vague and unsatisfying, was disappearance under unknown circumstances. But for the people of Havenwood, particularly the Blackwood family, this official pronouncement offered no solace. It merely formalized the terrible truth. Elara was gone, vanished without a trace, leaving behind only an echoing silence and a terrifying, unyielding mystery that had firmly embedded itself into the very soul of their quiet coastal town. The alarm had been sounded, but there was no fire to extinguish, no criminal to apprehend, only an emptiness that stretched into the unknown. With the official search concluded and no physical evidence to provide direction, the informal investigation by the residents of Havenwood transformed into something far more unsettling. The initial frantic search for Elara Blackwood slowly gave way to a pervasive, gnawing fear, fueled by a series of increasingly strange occurrences in the town itself. These were not dramatic events, but rather subtle shifts in the fabric of daily life, individually minor, but cumulatively unsettling. It began with the animals. Dogs, usually boisterous and friendly, became withdrawn and prone to inexplicable bouts of barking at empty spaces or cowering under porches. Cats, typically aloof, would stare intently at unseen points, their fur bristling, their eyes wide with what seemed like terror. Livestock in the surrounding farms grew skittish, their milk production dropping, their nights filled with restless movements and low, mournful cries that carried on the night wind. Farmers reported finding their barns strangely disturbed, not by thieves, but by an unsettling sense of recent presence, despite no evidence of entry. Tools would be subtly rearranged, gates left ajar, or items of little value inexplicably moved from one place to another. Then came the disappearances of objects. Small personal items would vanish from homes, only to reappear days later in unusual places. A child's favorite toy, lost for days, would be found on a high shelf in the pantry. A fishing lure, carefully stored, would turn up tucked into a boot in the entryway. These were not thefts, for nothing of real value was ever taken. It was as if an unseen hand was playing a mischievous, yet deeply unsettling game, testing the boundaries of what was considered rational. People began to check and recheck their locks, though they knew it was futile against an unseen, intangible intruder. More disturbing still were the sounds. In the quiet of the night, Havenwood, usually serenaded by the rhythmic crash of waves and the chirping of crickets, began to be punctuated by inexplicable noises. Faint, mournful keening sounds would drift from the woods, too high-pitched for any known animal. Sometimes, a series of soft rhythmic thumps would echo from the direction of the sea, sounding less like natural waves and more like a deliberate, heavy impact against the shore. And then there were the whispers, not clear words, but a low, sibilant murmur, just at the edge of hearing, seeming to emanate from the very air itself, particularly around the Blackwood home. Those who claimed to hear it often felt a chilling sensation, a sudden drop in temperature, and an overwhelming sense of being watched. These subtle disturbances began to chip away at the already fragile morale of Havenwood. People started to avoid going out after dark. Children were kept closer to home. The shared meals and friendly conversations that once defined the town's social life grew strained, replaced by wary glances and nervous silences. The initial assumption that Elara had simply wandered off or fallen victim to a mundane accident began to be replaced by a far more chilling hypothesis that something else was at play. The Blackwood family, caught at the epicenter of this strangeness, bore the brunt of it. Thomas, once so full of life, grew quiet and withdrawn. He would often stare intently at empty corners of the house, particularly Elara's room, sometimes muttering to himself, "She's here. I hear her." Martha, already consumed by grief, found her nerves frayed by the constant feeling of an unseen presence within their home. She would swear she heard footsteps in Elara's empty room the faint rustle of clothing, or the distinct scent of Elara's lavender soap where no one had been. Elias, ever the pragmatist, tried to dismiss these occurrences, attributing them to grief and overactive imaginations. But even he could not shake the feeling that their house, and indeed the entire town, had subtly shifted, becoming something alien and hostile. One evening, Martha found a single withered sea lily placed carefully on Elara's pillow. It was a flower that Elara loved, one that grew only in the most remote, rock-sheltered tidal pools, places difficult and dangerous to reach, especially for a child. Thomas vehemently denied putting it there, and Elias had been out fishing all day. The sight of it sent a fresh wave of terror through Martha. It was a gesture, a message, from something unseen, something that knew Elara intimately, and that was now making its presence known in their grieving home. The official investigation may have ended, but for Havenwood, the mystery of Elara's disappearance had only just begun. It was no longer just about a missing girl. It was about the slow, insidious encroachment of an unknown force, an unseen hand subtly manipulating their reality, leaving behind a trail of chilling questions and a town gripped by an ever-deepening, inarticulate dread. The familiar world of Havenwood was dissolving piece by piece into something unfathomable. As the weeks turned into months, and still no trace of Elara Blackwood emerged, the official avenues of explanation were exhausted. Without a body, without a suspect, without a single shred of tangible evidence, the case stagnated, becoming a cold file in the distant city-based police archives. But in Havenwood, the mystery was far from over. It festered, mutating into something far more ancient and insidious, weaving itself into the very fabric of local folklore and whispered superstitions. The logical, mundane explanations were offered first, and then slowly dismissed. Had she run away? Unlikely, given her quiet nature, her deep affection for her family, and the lack of any prior indication or preparation. Had she met with a tragic accident at sea? Possible, but the complete absence of any clothing or personal items, the lack of a storm, and the diligent search of the coastline made it increasingly improbable. Had she been abducted by a passing stranger? Again, no witnesses, no signs of struggle, and the isolation of Havenwood made such an opportunistic crime difficult to conceal. Each rational theory withered under the weight of the inexplicable. In the vacuum of answers, older, darker beliefs began to surface, unearthed from the deep-seated fears and ancestral memories of the coastal community. These were the stories told on long, dark nights, of strange lights on the water, of ancient things stirring in the deep, of the land itself holding malevolent spirits. Some whispered of the Sea Wife, a figure from local legend, said to be a beautiful but cruel entity dwelling in the deepest abysses, occasionally rising to claim a young soul, particularly one with an artistic temperament, to join her in her eternal watery domain. These tales spoke of an irresistible call, a siren-like lure that would draw unsuspecting individuals to the shore, where they would simply walk into the waves and vanish without a ripple. Elara's love for the sea, her artistic nature, and her quiet, contemplative walks along the isolated coves seemed to fit this tragic narrative with an unsettling precision. Had the Sea Wife found her, beckoned her to an eternal embrace beneath the waves? Others spoke of the Hollow Ones, being said to dwell in the dense, ancient woods behind Havenwood. These entities were not violent, but rather insidious, believed to possess the ability to mimic human forms and voices, luring individuals into the labyrinthine depths of the forest, where they would become hopelessly lost, their memories slowly stripped away until they were nothing more than empty husks, wandering the perpetual twilight between worlds. The suddenness of Elara's disappearance, the lack of any sound or struggle, the peculiar stillness that often settled over the woods after dark. These elements resonated eerily with the tales of the Hollow Ones. The inexplicable movements of objects in homes, the whispering voices, the disoriented animals. Could these be signs of their subtle manipulation, their slow encroachment into the human world? More chillingly, a few older residents, their voices hushed, spoke of the fading, a rare and terrible occurrence detailed in long-forgotten journals of the earliest settlers. The fading was not a kidnapping or a death, but a gradual, subtle erosion of a person's presence from reality itself. It was said to be caused by a particular confluence of environmental and spiritual factors, where the veil between worlds thinned, allowing a person to simply cease to be. Their memory would slowly fade from the minds of others. Their possessions would vanish or become unremarkable, and eventually, even their physical existence would be utterly erased. The frightening aspect of the fading was its insidious nature. Those left behind would eventually forget or convince themselves that the vanished person had never truly existed, a terrifying form of existential erasure. The increasingly strange phenomena in Havenwood, the animal behavior, the moving objects, the disembodied sounds, lent credence to these unsettling theories. They were not mere coincidences. They felt like deliberate actions, a subtle prodding from a hidden dimension. The fear transformed from a specific worry about Elara into a generalized terror of the unknown, of the very ground beneath their feet being unstable, of the air they breathed being full of unseen watchers. Elias and Martha Blackwood, though they tried to cling to rational hope, found themselves increasingly vulnerable to these dark whispers. Martha, especially, felt the constant chilling presence within her home, convinced that Elara was not simply gone, but here, yet not here, trapped in some unseen liminal space. Thomas's cryptic pronouncements only deepened this sense of unease, as if he, with the unfiltered perception of childhood, was closer to understanding the true, terrifying nature of their loss. The official investigation may have ended, but in the haunted imagination of Havenwood, the mystery of Elara Blackwood had opened a door to something far older, far more terrifying, a revelation that suggested their world was not as solid or as safe as they had always believed. The line between fact and folklore had blurred, and in that blurring lay a profound and unsettling truths. The disappearance of Elara Blackwood and the subsequent cascade of unsettling events left an indelible mark on Havenwood. The tight-knit community, once a beacon of mutual support, began to fracture under the weight of sustained fear and unanswered questions. The initial outpouring of sympathy for the Blackwood family slowly gave way to a more complex, uneasy avoidance. People found themselves subtly steering clear of Elias and Martha, not out of malice, but out of a deep-seated discomfort with the unknown. The Blackwoods, after all, were the epicenter of the strangeness, the family touched by the incomprehensible. The local press, after an initial flurry of sensationalist reports, quickly lost interest. Without a body, a suspect, or a dramatic twist, the story of a missing girl in a remote coastal town simply didn't sell papers for long. The few articles that persisted were relegated to the back pages, filled with vague speculation and ultimately offering no new insights. This journalistic silence only amplified the town's sense of isolation, confirming that the world outside had little interest in their peculiar horror. For the Blackwood family, life became a living nightmare. Martha Blackwood, once vibrant and resilient, retreated into a silent grief, her days spent in a perpetual state of mourning, her eyes often fixed on Elara's empty room, as if willing her daughter to reappear. She would often leave out small plates of Elara's favorite foods, convinced that her daughter, in some unseen form, might return to partake. Her once strong faith was replaced by a desperate, superstitious adherence to old rituals, hoping to appease whatever unseen force had taken her child. Elias, the steadfast fisherman, grew gaunt and hollow-eyed. His once steady hands began to tremble, his gaze distant. He continued to fish, for it was his livelihood, but the joy had long since departed. He often returned from the sea with nothing, his mind too preoccupied by the vast unknowable depths, seeing in every wave the potential secret of Elara's fate. The financial strain, coupled with the emotional devastation, began to wear him down, body and soul. Young Thomas, perhaps the most profoundly affected, never fully recovered his childhood innocence. He continued to speak of Elara as if she were still present, sometimes even holding hushed conversations with empty spaces. His once bright eyes held a haunted quality, as if he carried the burden of a secret too terrible for his young mind to fully comprehend. He developed an intense aversion to both the sea and the woods, refusing to venture far from the house, gripped by an unspoken terror that something might take him too. The peculiar phenomena in Havenwood did not cease. The animal behaviors continued, though less frequently. Objects still moved, and the faint, disembodied whispers persisted, particularly on moonless nights. These occurrences became a morbid part of the town's atmosphere, a constant, low-level hum of unease that permeated every aspect of life. Houses that had once been open and welcoming now kept their doors locked, their windows often curtained. The once bustling town square grew quieter, social interactions more guarded. Children, once free to roam, were kept under stricter supervision, their innocence shadowed by the town's shared trauma. Over the years, the story of Elara Blackwood faded from the immediate consciousness of the younger generations, becoming a cautionary tale, a piece of local folklore whispered around campfires or in hushed tones by older relatives. The name Havenwood itself, once signifying safety, began to evoke a subtle shiver of unease, a place where the veil between worlds felt thinner, where the natural order had been irrevocably disturbed. The Blackwood house, once a beacon of quiet domesticity, became a symbol of the town's enduring mystery. It slowly fell into disrepair, its windows like vacant eyes staring out at the sea, a silent monument to a family broken and a life inexplicably extinguished. The small garden, once tended by Elara, became overgrown, choked by weeds, a stark metaphor for the life that had been abruptly cut short. The legacy of Elara Blackwood was not a historical event with clear dates and causes, but rather an enduring enigma, a wound in the collective memory of Havenwood that refused to heal. It was a story without an ending, a question without an answer, a chilling reminder that some disappearances are not merely physical, but existential, leaving behind not just absence, but a profound and unsettling alteration of reality itself. The events of 1912 ensured that Havenwood would forever be remembered, not for its fishing or its quiet charm, but for the chilling, irresolvable mystery of the girl who simply vanished. More than a century has passed since Elara Blackwood vanished from Havenwood. The world has changed beyond recognition. The flickering gaslights of 1912 have been replaced by the omnipresent glow of electricity, horse-drawn carriages by fleets of automobiles, and telegrams by instantaneous global communication. Yet, the mystery of Elara Blackwood remains, a cold, unyielding point of darkness in the annals of an otherwise brightly illuminated history. It is a story that refuses to be confined to the dusty pages of archived newspapers or the fading memories of a long-gone generation. Modern investigators, armed with advanced forensic techniques and psychological profiling, would find themselves just as baffled by Elara's case as Constable Miller was in 1912. There is no DNA evidence, no digital footprint, no surveillance footage to pore over. Only the stark, undeniable fact of an absence and the chilling corroborative whispers of a community forever altered. The conditions that allowed Elara to simply evaporate, leaving no trace, are precisely what makes her disappearance so profoundly unsettling, defying all attempts at rational explanation. The theories that sprang from the fear-addled minds of Havenwood's residents, the sea wife, the hollow ones, the fading, these are dismissed by the modern scientific mind as mere folklore, superstitions born of ignorance. Yet, in the absence of any other explanation, they linger, whispering at the edges of our understanding. For how else does one account for a complete and utter erasure? How does one reconcile the meticulous search efforts with the absolute void left behind? The true horror of Elara Blackwood's disappearance lies not in a violent act or a clear tragedy, but in the insidious nature of its ambiguity. It forces us to confront the limitations of our knowledge, the fragility of our perceived reality. It suggests that there are forces at play, mechanisms of the world, that operate beyond the comforting confines of logic and reason. It implies that some people, under certain unknown conditions, can simply cease to be, not through death, but through an inexplicable detachment from existence itself. The echoes of Havenwood in 1912 continue to resonate. One can visit the site today, though Havenwood itself has largely faded, its old buildings crumbling, its population dwindled to a handful of year-round residents. The Blackwood house, long abandoned, stands as a skeletal silhouette against the often stormy Massachusetts sky, its empty windows staring out at the unforgiving sea. The once vibrant garden is now a tangled mass of wild growth, reclaiming the earth, erasing the last vestiges of Elara's brief, artistic life. Stand on the desolate, windswept shore where Elara once walked, and one can almost feel the residual chill in the air, a faint, lingering presence of something vast and indifferent. The rhythmic crash of the waves, the mournful cry of the gulls, the endless expanse of the sea, and the inscrutable silence of the woods, they offer no answers, only a profound sense of the world's enduring indifference to human suffering and the terrifying scale of the unknown. Elara Blackwood's story is a chilling reminder that even in an age of accelerating enlightenment and scientific discovery, there remain fundamental mysteries that refuse to yield their secrets. It is a testament to the enduring power of the ineffable, a testament to the terrifying realization that not every question has an answer, and not every absence can be explained. Some voids simply remain, echoing with the whispers of what might have been, and the unsettling truth that we, as mere mortals, are far more vulnerable to the encroaching darkness than we often dare to imagine. The quiet disappearance of a young girl in a forgotten coastal town in 1912 serves as a perpetual unsettling reflection, a chilling testament to the persistent, unyielding grip of the truly unknown. The enigma of Elara Blackwood continues to haunt, a silent, spectral question mark carved into the very landscape of Massachusetts, a constant whisper from the depths of a profound and irresolvable mystery.